This is the Medicine Girl podcast with renowned healing expert and registered nurse Robin Stebbins. Every week, we shine the light on new ways to heal your body from the root, ignite your inner healer, and tap into your divine wisdom. Begin to live harmoniously with your mind, body, and spirit. You are stronger than you think, braver than you realize. Now is the time to wake up and start living healthier, wealthier, and laugh out loud happier. And here we go.
Hello and welcome to the Medicine Girl podcast. It's me, your host, Robin Stebbins, and today I'm beyond excited to have one of my personal inspirations for my life, David Baerwald. And instead of listing your accolades, that would probably take the whole hour. I would like for you just to introduce yourself and kind of explore and share who you are in this moment, because we are always changing. So who is the David Baerwald that I see before me right now?
Well, the David Baerwald you're seeing before you right now is, hold on a second. The guy that just finished writing this.
Oh.
This is actually only part of it. There's another 180 pages. So yeah, this is what I've been doing for 3 years.
Wow.
I pretty much, I either quit or took a very long hiatus from music for a number of reasons. Primarily this actually, but also just, it was right. It's kind of, I mean, I suppose there is a relation to the spiritual side of things. I'll tell you the story, what happened. I was not thrilled with what I was doing. You know, I was, kind of stuck in a sort of strange corporate world. There were just a lot of things, and so, including the fact that I needed to shut down this house in Los Angeles. And what complicated that, there's a whole thing to do. The house had to be cleaned out. It had to be sold. It had to be, kind of fixed up for the real estate people, all kinds of stuff like that. And it was really a nightmare, to be honest. And then what complicated that, this was in 2017, was that the whole area surrounding the place burst into flame.
Oh my gosh.
So it was in the Brentwood Hills, and the whole place was just on fire. And the house had been in the family for a long time, for over 60 years. And there was a lot of stuff in it, and there were these storage units in the carport, these kind of big cabinet things, and I was emptying them out. Most of the stuff was garbage, really, or just things that I didn't, shovels or things like that. But then there was this one that had about, I'm going to say about maybe 12 or 14 old boxes in it that I'd never looked at before. They were buried under tarps and, lawn equipment and water hoses, Hot Wheel car toy sets. And my first inclination was, given the closeness of the fire, the fact that these boxes had probably been sitting there since the house was bought, my inclination was probably, well, let's just put this stuff in the dumpster, and I'd hired a girl, actually an archivist, to help me with some of the other stuff that I found in the house. And she said, no, you can't do that. You have to at least look at one. And so I looked at one, and one of the first things I found was a letter from Franklin Roosevelt. And that started, well, and then there were letters from from Einstein, you know, sort of historical figures like Henry Morgenthau and people like that, you know, weren't necessarily people I would recognize, but I'd heard their name before. And then I also started finding all these, then I started finding all these photos. Here, let me show you some of these things.
Yeah. And are those some of the ones you're posting on Instagram? Because those are fascinating.
Oh yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it was my grandfather.
Yeah, I've been following those.
My grandfather was in Japan. Yeah, so it's like this kind of stuff.
Wow.
Anyway, so he had moved to Japan in 1910. And I had always been told that, he was just this really sweet guy. He was a humanitarian. I mean, he'd rescued thousands and thousands and thousands of refugees fleeing Hitler. Who I mean, not rescued, but there was a Japanese diplomat who was signing up visas for, I think he was in Estonia. Mm-hmm. And he just kind of went to town. He issued thousands and thousands and thousands of visas without even filling out any paperwork, just so that people could flee. And so then people fleeing in Europe would go through Estonia and into Russia, this terrible walk that they had to take, hundreds of miles, and they would meet up with the Siberian Railway, take that to the southeast tip of Siberia, and from there, which is Vladivostok, and then from there take a boat to Tokyo, where my father and his two associates would greet them and give them money and clothes and find them places to live. Gradually, it turned out, you know, his life, which I'd only heard little tiny bits about, was, you know, gradually, bit by bit, as I was finding stuff, was revealing itself to me to be this astonishing adventure that started out with his father. Now, his father, as it turns out, was the headmaster of this school, which I'd known of. I knew that he was involved in youth education or something. What I didn't know is that the school had been founded by the Rothschild banking family to recruit and train promising youths for their various enterprises, banking and the like. And of course, my grandfather and his brothers and sisters all went, and two of his sisters all went through the school, and they all had extraordinary lives. I mean, his sister was among the first licensed women doctors in Germany. His brother was, did everything from building the London rail system to huge amounts of New York, and then during World War I, he'd started this refugee assistance agency called the JDC with one of the Rothschilds and a guy named Jacob Schiff, who's a big banker in Manhattan. And that became the biggest refugee agency in the world for many, many years. So, all these guys had extraordinary lives. Even the kind of black sheep, there was a sort of, anyway, so I found myself in this milieu of all these extraordinarily brainy German Jews who were at the pivot point of basically every major historical event of the 20th century. So my grandfather went to Japan to take over the offices of this chemical concern, in this German chemical concern that was growing rapidly. that turned out to be IG Farben, the German, the sort of Nazi war machine.
Right.
It didn't start out that way. They started out by literally saving the world with this new chemical process that quadrupled the agricultural output of
Right.
farms, which was really necessary at that time because
it always seems like, the intentions are always good.
The intentions were terrific, and then, they were 6 different companies in and around Frankfurt. And, they all had different things that they did. They didn't become IG Farben until 1925. And so we'll get to that. Sorry, I just woke up, so I'm a little confused, but, so he ran this office in Tokyo for 4 years, and then World War I broke out, and there was this one issue with Japan and Germany. Japan was allies with England, who were at war with Germany, which the Japanese probably wouldn't have paid much attention to, except for the Germans had this town that was basically a German city called Tsingtao, which is why there's Tsingtao beer.
Oh.
And so they decided to have a war over this bit of land. And so my grandfather, probably didn't have to, but he did, went and fought in Tsingtao. They were overwhelmed. They were outmanned 6-1. There were 30,000 Japanese troops and 5,000 Germans, and they also had British warships and ironically enough, Japan itself had a very modern navy, partially due to my great uncle's efforts, who had helped buy the Japanese their entire navy, $200 million. And so these British warships that his brother had paid for are busy, dropping bombs on his head. And they fought as best they could for a while, and then they finally surrendered, of course, after losing way too many people. And so then began this other chapter that was so surprising, which was prison. So they were in a prisoner of war camp, which you think, when you hear Japanese prisoner of war camp, you think, the Bataan Death March and people's heads getting cut off. It was nothing of the kind. It was, in a way, if there was any it's the best way to spend a war, because they were treated like kings, really. Not like kings, but they were treated like humans.
Right.
There was this extraordinary leader, this guy named Matsue, Colonel Matsue, whose family had been vanquished in a terrible war themselves in the Japanese Civil War, had been grossly humiliated and mistreated as a youth by the victors, and was, and didn't want to hurt anybody. And why do
you think that was? Like, how does that happen?
And he kind of took it on himself. Their first year was terrible. A lot of people died of dysentery. This is before this guy showed up.
Right. Because
they were originally guarded by the people that they'd fought, which is kind of a no-no, I suppose, in the military, to be held prisoner for any length of time by your combat opponents. So they were mistreated and put in holes and starved, and so anyway, after a year, this new commandant came along, and he looked around. He's like, well, this is terrible. And he said, well, the first thing, first, of course, we've got to build better housing, and let's give you guys better clothes, and let's, everybody, I think you all need to have a garden, and
wow.
I think we should have a swimming pool, and I think we should have tennis courts, and I think you guys, I think all of you guys should, whatever you ever wanted to do in civilian life, I think you should do that. So one guy always wanted to make ice cream like his mother, so he started an ice cream shop, and there was a print shop, and there were artists, and there were these orchestras. Oh, here, by the way, here's.
I want to go there.
This is Colonel Matsue.
Oh wow! Right, the mustache.
And they started an orchestra, and it was a huge orchestra. There were actually six bands. There was this thing called the Wild Harmonica Boys, which was this like 6-piece harmonica and mandolin band, but all the way up to 120 person orchestra. And there was this guy at Bondo, was the name of the prison camp, who'd been a band leader in Berlin, and he had this crazy vision for Bondo. And so he said, mark my words, next Christmas we're going to play the first of Wagner's Ring series, which is a daunting thing to attempt, even if you're the New York Symphony.
Right.
The idea that a bunch of soldiers with, some of which, there were some professional musicians there, because there was a military band that had been drafted. And my grandfather was a pretty good violinist. And sure enough, they did it. And it started, and, they had there's like roles for 80 women in this particular opera to sing. Of course, it had not a single one. And so Engel, the band leader guy, came up with the idea. It's like, okay, well, we'll just have men who can sing as high as they can, sing the high bits, and then we'll follow them around with 8 piccolos playing the melody an octave above what they're singing. Wagner probably would not have approved, but it worked, and it became like this thing. The local villagers became a part of it. They started teaching. They started giving lessons to kids. There was one kid in particular that was super talented that became a professional violinist and started this very respected music school on the South Islands of Japan. The finance minister came. Their girlfriends could come visit if they wanted to. It was World War I. It was hell on earth. But these guys were lived this kind of and the other weird thing about it is that they got primarily English newspapers. So they read about World War I from the perspective of the extremely propagandized British press, so they're like, right. The Hun, who's the Hun? Well, that's us, Fritz, wow. We're the Hun. Why do they call us that?
So they created this little paradise bubble.
What's that?
They've created sort of a paradise bubble in the midst of World War I.
Yeah, exactly, right. They actually made a movie about it. The Japanese and German collaborated on a movie about it called Paradise for the Bearded Men, I think is what it's called. And but that was just the beginning. So I thought, well, that's an interesting story, and but then he got out of prison in 1920, and suddenly, almost out of nowhere, he became kind of the king of expatriate society in Japan. He all of a sudden had this huge mansion and this car and servants and this and a wife who he'd never met, my grandmother. And this friend of theirs, yeah.
Right.
Now I'm going to cut ahead. So, because this is what happens in this book as well. So my father was born in Japan. He spoke the language very well. And his father somehow ended up in 1941 in San Francisco teaching at the spy school, teaching at the OSS school at the Presidio. He was an instructor of intelligence officers. And I was like, well, how the hell did that happen? And then I found a bunch of other stuff too. I'll get to my father in a second. With my grandfather, there's pictures of him and the Crown Prince of Japan in Berlin, and clearly my grandfather is in charge of the situation. He's always in the center of the photograph. He's like, ordering people about. I found pictures that he'd taken on the street of, of the early Nazis in 1933, marching around with their uniforms and stuff. And I found a letter to his brother saying that he'd met, this evil person named Martin Bormann, who was a huge ranking Nazi. He was translating for the imperial family at that time. So anyway, so that's enough for my grandfather to know. So my father grew up in Tokyo with his best friend, who became my godfather. And they came to America in 1940. And the FBI was just all over them because they were dual enemy aliens. They were German, Japanese. And so my mother told me, my grandfather told me, my grandmother told her that, oh yes, there were two different groups of FBI agents that were following your grandfather around, the German desk and the Japanese desk, and they hated each other. The agents hated each other, and they would argue, and so I started bringing them sandwiches. Anyway, so my father was trained as an American intelligence officer and shipped over to Japan. Fortunately for him, right after the bombings. And, I spent quite a bit of my childhood there, and he became a professor, but he did spend, a good period of time in Tokyo after the war working on this thing called the purge of Japanese leadership, which sounds weird. It wasn't like a Stalinistic purge where people were summarily executed in the courtyard. It was, they were trials. They were getting rid of all the militarists and fascists, theoretically, in the Japanese government. And so my father became, a part of that operation, and that's really where the story begins. All this other stuff is sort of backstory in a sense. Right. So I don't want to get too much into what I discovered, but as it relates to spiritualism, if you were to look at it metaphorically, say that I found the dragon's eggs in the fire and took them home and started trying to take care of them, and the thing hatched. And now I'm living with a dragon. And
that's really intriguing, especially for some reason it seems to me like in families, like the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his family history, like it's almost like a genetic code for you to follow this path.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah. And I did follow it without knowing what it was. And this was part of my problems,
What do you mean part of your problems?
Well, I wasn't like many boys.
Yeah.
I wasn't like the other boys. Well, I'd grown up in a really pretty freaky situation with not just things that I was hearing around the house, but also just, Japan in the 60s, in the late 60s and 70s, which is when we were there, when I was there as a child, was exploding. There was a civil war happening. It was riots all the time. I mean, and it's like when the Japanese know how to riot.
They don't mess around.
They are. I mean, I've never seen anything like it.
There's no permits gotten or.
Well, I think they actually do that, but once they get there, or maybe they don't. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's like they treat it like medieval war. With small unit commanders and color-coded helmets and whistle commands, and if the Japanese authorities would bring in riot police and plexiglass and armor and stuff like that, and whenever the rebels would see this, they would just go and pick up their telephone poles. Like 80 of them would pick up 10 telephone poles, or 5 telephone poles or whatever, and they would just use them as battering rams and run down the street and bash through these Japanese lines. I mean, it was mayhem, Molotov cocktails, and we got involved in some of that. I mean, I had no idea what the ideology was that anybody was. Right. I was like 10.
What effect, though, as a boy, would that have on your psyche or your spirit or your sense of safety?
Yeah, no, it was, I mean, they were burning my father in effigy in the streets, and they would surround our house at times and do this thing called a snake dance. It was extremely intimidating. They would just link arms, and if you look up snake dance Japanese riots, you'll see what I mean.
Post that.
Anyway, yeah, so it was quite explosive, and we actually had to flee the country when I think I was 11, and I was just coming home from school, and my sister was like, "What's wrong? Where have you been?" I was like, "I was just coming back from school." She said, "Well, we're leaving." And I said, "Well, let me just get my bike." He says, "You don't need your bike." And I was like, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, we're going." I was, "Where?" "To America." I mean, I knew nothing. I mean, what I knew about America, I basically got from Westerns, and I didn't know fuck all about the United States, really. I mean, it was sort of this Valhalla across the ocean, but I where Coca-Cola came from. That was basically what so sure enough, I mean, and it was a hell of a day too, because there were all these different groups, and the most active group was this group called the Zengakuran. They were ideologically, they were basically sort of hard left, communist anarchist, really aggressive. Fritz Fanon, Chinese communist trained agitators and people like that were part of this group, and so they really knew how to organize and fight. Yeah. And, they would take on the Japanese riot police without even thinking about it. A lot of their stuff was based around these martial arts schools, so they were all kendo. The Japanese sword fighting experts, or at least well trained, and they would. They didn't actually use swords, but they used these. They're called training swords, made out of wood, but they still pack a wallop. Yeah. And they're enough to break plexiglass, which they did, and I know this sounds like a really chaotic story, and it's kind of all over the place. Anyway, so I always, and so I had a lot of problems as a young fella, and my father was never able to tell anything to me about anything that was true.
Oh, really? So So there was no explanation to what was going on. It was just kind of chaos.
It was sort of chaos. I mean, I remember, there's one encounter I had with my father where, he was always like this. He was even hard for adults to understand what he was saying because he spoke in euphemisms and epigrams, and they never really told you what you wanted to know, and he had a really grim outlook on things, like he would say things like, well, any idiot can fake a suicide, but it takes an artist to cause one. things like that. Huh. So he was a difficult guy to get to know in any way, but one thing I knew damn well was that I did not want to be in that line of work. I didn't want to have anything to do with any of it.
Yes.
And which is how I became a musician.
What do you mean that's how you became a musician? It's like,
well, it's how I chose that path rather than
it was like, I don't want to do this, but then that gives you an infinite number of things.
Yeah. Well,
so what gravitated you?
Well, I'd always liked it, and I'd had a knack for it, and actually my sister, my eldest sister, who was 7 years older than me, said, well, if you want to make friends in new places, because, you should learn to play the bass, because everybody always everybody always wants to play the guitar. And so there's always a cajillion guitar players. So you should just learn how to play the bass, and everybody will want you in their band. And I was like, okay. So I actually did get a bass. I got a K, which actually now would be really prized, but at the time it was like a sort of a Sears kind of a thing made out of cardboard, basically. Not cardboard, but like mace, like the kind of stuff you make counter, old kitchen counter, linoleum.
Linoleum kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, and so I got one of those, and I met this guy, and he had a guitar, and so we started this band, and I was probably like, by this time I'm probably like 14, extremely freaked out kid.
How long have you been in the United States? At
this point, I've been in the United States for 3 years, but I'm still, I am one weird ass kid.
Yeah.
Paranoid. I'm still like that. If you tap me on the shoulder.
Well, you've got that PTSD, right?
You bet.
So.
Yeah, to this day, if you walk up behind me and tap me on the shoulder, it either I'll jump up to the ceiling or you'll get a karate chop in the throat, So
it's still in your body.
Yeah, I had to work it out. I did a lot of, I spent an enormous amount of time with a psychiatrist doing this really drastic treatment to try to cure me. This was years before. This was when not long after my son was born. And I realized that I was just a basket case, and I was probably going to pass it on to him if I didn't do something. So I took some very serious efforts, and and start anyway. So I'm this weird kid, but I can play the bass now. I got this. There was this fantastic woman session player. Part of the whole Wrecking Crew in LA. And she wrote a book about how to play the bass, basically. A lot of people have learned from it, over the years. And I just kind of went through that book, and it's like, oh, that's how you do it. Oh, here's the octave. Oh, that's what an octave is. Oh, that's what a third is. That's what a minor third is. Oh, I get it. That's what a sharp four. That's what that's the difference between an augmented and a suspended, and you gradually learn all this stuff, which of course doesn't help you much when you're in punk rock, which is what I was. But I was interested in it. And, my father and I had pretty serious issues, and we ended up having this big brawl finally when I was around 17.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to leave home, and so I set off with my bass and I had the world's worst bass. It was a polytone cube. It was just a piece of garbage, but it was enough to learn and to practice with and stuff. And and then this band that I was in, we started, we came up with the extreme skateboard crew in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
That was the area we were in. So we would find ourselves playing at a lot of, pool parties and things like that. At pool parties, in this case, meaning emptied of water,
right.
And just your kid would have loved it.
Yeah.
I saw the documentary Dogtown and Z-Boys,
mm-hmm.
which is a cool documentary, but I saw it with my son actually, and I just, at a certain point in the movie, I just burst into tears because I'd forgotten all of this stuff,
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't forgotten it. I remembered this and that, but it really, seeing the film from that time, and I even think there's a brief thing where I'm like walking by in one of the backgrounds. Yeah. I don't know if it's actually me, but it looks like me, and I had a shirt like that. So I was kind of this waif playing punk rock and skateboard parties, and the punk rock scene in LA was starting to blossom. There were all these new clubs opening up, and you could play original material. And at one point, the Whiskey A Go-Go, which was kind of a legendary small venue in Los Angeles, put an advertisement in the LA Times saying, auditions for punk rock bands, So they're like, well, we're a punk rock band, why don't we go audition? And we made it. And we started playing, we started doing really well. And I mean, not really well, but, we were playing all the clubs and on all the venues with, I mean, we did, the Germs, who were tremendously influential. We did endless numbers of shows with those guys. And, gradually kind of learned how to do it. But, anyway, at some point, I can't remember exactly how this happened, but somehow I ended up singing in this band. Oh, I know how it was. We'd done a show somewhere, and this guy there from this little record company, Bomp Records, said, I'd like to make a single on you guys. It's like, what does that mean? He said, well, one of those little records, 45 with 2 songs on it. And we're like, well, mm-hmm. Really? And he said, yeah, I'll pay for you to go in the studio and you can go do it. And so we was like, well, that's fantastic. And when it came time for us to do it, the singer had a panic attack and, a crisis of confidence or God knows what. And I said, no, I can't do it. I'm quitting. I'm going off to be a Benedictine monk or something. Yeah. And and so we're sitting around going, well, what do we do? We have this recording date tomorrow. And, the band was sort of run by this kind of a bully guy. He was sort of our leader also, not only in music, but also in martial arts. He was a much more advanced sort of Hapkido expert and a tremendously intimidating guy. 7th degree black belt now, which is a lot. He we're sitting around. He was not the most nuanced individual. And we're like, what are we going to do? And then everybody kind of looks at me and I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm like the geekiest, most awkward, socially inadequate person in the group. And I'm like, well, you wrote the damn lyrics. Like I had to pay for that.
Right.
Sid, lyrics such as, it's like, well, you sing them. You're the singer. You wrote them. I was like, you're out of your mind. So anyway, we do it. We go to the studio. The guy runs it seemed to have a pretty good handle on what he was doing. And he lowers this big ass German mic, and I open my mouth, and all of a sudden this huge kind of like this huge voice comes out, and everybody's looking at me like, dude, what's that? And the guy actually that ran the place was like, I do demos here all the time, and if you ever want to like make some extra money, you can sing on these demos. So I actually started doing that. And
is that the first time you were aware that or the first time your voice came out?
Like that, it sure was. Yeah, I mean, I'd been kind of adopted in a way by this really wonderful woman teacher in junior high school, who was part of the Wagner chorale, and she wanted me in her master thing. I thought it was too wussy or something. I didn't do it, but I didn't want to sing Missa Solemnis or whatever. So I was much more the, angry rebel poet, motorcycle guy with the guitar thing. That was much more of where I was at, in other words, a total asshole. So, so I knew, but I know I had never, it's a very different thing to sing as part of 100 people than it is as one guy. So I had never done this before, and it was like all of a sudden it's like, dude, you're Elvis,
right?
Because I had this sort of like this. It was a bizarrely well tuned instrument.
Yeah.
And it was just like, oh wow, I didn't think much more of it than I would my height, for instance, or
right.
It was just one of those things. And so I became a singer. And it was around that time, I was living in this god-awful sort of punk rock flop house in Hollywood with all these skinheads and neo-Nazis and car thieves and prostitutes. Great. And it was quite an apartment. And it was a house. It was called Skinhead Manor. And I didn't know skinheads and Nazis were the same thing. So I was like, well, all right, it's cheap, But anyway, it was near Guitar Center, and my bass broke. It was really and it just broke in half, and I was just like, this thing is just dead. So I had to get a new bass. And so I went to Guitar Center, and I was trying out basses. And this guy was there, all frazzled, and he goes, what are you doing later on? And I was like, what do you mean? He says, can you do a session tonight? What kind of a session? A recording session. Yeah. Where? He says, we're at Sunset Sound, like just almost across the street. It was just right down the road a little bit, and legendary studio. And I was maybe 18, about to turn 18. I was 17 or 18. Frazzled, PTSD, homeless, essentially, living with Nazis, in this punk band. It was a pretty grimy existence. And
so it was pretty easy to say yes to these requests.
Well, you bet. I really needed something to do. And so it turned out that the guy that had found me in Guitar Center, that their bass player, who was the bass player in Booker T and the MGs, Duck Dunn, one of the greatest lay it down bass players in history. But he was in LA, and so it turned out that the guy that had found me was this guy Brian Ray, who now we know as Paul McCartney's music director. But at that time, he was just a really hot shit guitar player in LA and producer. And he was producing all these weird little recording projects. And this particular one was a ballet. It was a privately commissioned kind of rock ballet thing. To be honest, I cannot remember one thing about it other than these just wonderful women who just kind of, a few of them were just sort of, they were intrigued by this like street urchin that they found.
We must know more.
Yeah, so they kind of adopted me, and they sort of took care of me for a couple of years. And in a way, I mean, but in the meantime, I had gotten involved in a lot of other kind of things that probably weren't quite as wholesome as they might have been, and at a certain point, I found myself in a real bind with, and I don't want to go too much into it, but with organized crime and I found myself in a very bad place.
Well, up until this point, from what I've heard, that just had to happen at some point,
Yeah.
With everything going on and trauma and PTSD, unresolved PTSD, and a dad is not really explaining anything that's going on. Now we're like, I've got a deep hole. I would like to fill that with something.
Exactly. Well, it was a similar kind of thing. I got adopted. I was playing, I moved to Venice at some point. And I was just eking out a living, sleeping on people's couches when I could, and not, just under the bridge when I couldn't. I was still working out all the time. So I was, there's the difference between a bum and a homeless person is a place to shower.
Okay. That's the designation.
I had that, by that time I'd been long enough that I didn't even really, I just had to go and clean the mats and, so I didn't really have, so I had a job sort of that it didn't pay me anything, but it kept me in training. And,
what's going through your mind? Because I know, when we go through those deep, deep, dark places, sometimes there's a part of our spirit that's like, keep going. And then other times, other people are like, this is over. Let's just give up. So do you remember what kind of spiritual energy or soul connection, or was it just survival one moment to the next?
It was pretty much survival. I mean, the closest thing I had to spiritual encounters would have been with women.
Yeah. The kind of those ballet.
Well, there was a bit of that. There was another one later that was quite a bit more problematic, but yeah,
so you had at least some balance of kindness and love.
Yeah, I'd always, I was a curly-haired little pretty boy kind of, and and sort of, I think, I don't know, I didn't really have difficulty in that regard, and there's the old joke, what do you call a guitar player who's single, who doesn't have a girlfriend? Homeless. So, I sort of bounced from situation to situation. Anyway, such a creep. But anyway, the police thing and the gang, the mafia thing had got to be completely out of control. And, it made our little band kind of impossible to maintain. So also the police intervened, and
I was wondering if that was going to come in.
Yeah, the police had intervened. I had gone state's evidence against these mobsters, which was frightening in and of itself.
Yeah.
But part of my sentencing was that I had to be under my parents' command. By this time I'm like 20. I've been on my own for 4 years, 3.5
Yeah.
years, and I'm a tough little fucker, you know.
Yeah.
I'm not who you want to have in your house. Um, and my parents, I didn't know this, were going through a divorce. And one day my father just disappeared. Oh, and I had to work construction. I had to have a normal job. So
Okay.
I got a job. So I'm living with ultimately my mother, who's been completely crushed by the
divorce.
By my father just finally disappearing, you know, leaving her as cold-blooded a manner as you could after 30 years of marriage or 20 years of marriage. And so she was going through all this hell, but at least I had a roof over my head. And one of the ballet girls that I'd met also was a story reader for Orion Pictures. And she was like, well, you're a clever kid. You know, you could probably do this. You read really fast. And so she taught me how to read screenplays and do what's called story coverage. And I found that really fascinating. And so I started getting to the point where I could do 3 books or 5 screenplays in a week. And you could actually make decent money doing, I mean, what I thought was decent money.
Yeah.
And so I did that. And ultimately what I realized was, but I still had the musical hankering. And I knew this guy who I'd met who was, you know, it's a funny thing about musicians. They're like basketball players in a way. You know, it's like you find yourself in your little crew. And if you rise to the top of that little crew, if you're the best player in that little crew, then you get to play with the slightly better crew. And I was always used to being like the guy that could pick up any instrument and play it and, you know, blindfolded. So I was very proud of myself as far as that went, stupidly so. And I'd met this other guy who kind of blew me out of the water. He was a few years older and he was just a much more seasoned, particularly on the guitar. And that was David Ricketts, who we started this David and David thing with.
Yes.
I kind of, you know, I mean, by some bizarre circumstance, found myself kind of a rock star for about 1.5 years or 2 years. It was not something that I was suited for. Psychologically.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that and how if you did stay grounded or out of the fray, or did.
No, I did not stay the slightest bit grounded. You know, in no time at all, I was living with Madonna and, you know,
wow.
Going, you know, it's like one day I was being hunted by all these killers, and the next I'm on some kind of television show in Italy with the finance minister, you know, doing the musical on the variety show. So it was really a shocking transition, you know, because that record came out. I mean, it was not like a huge commercial hit, but it was a really influential one, and it was a rare one in that it was both critically well received and commercially, you know, it did really well. And suddenly I was, to my mind anyway, just insanely wealthy.
Yeah.
And living, you know, this bizarre life. You know, I was living up in Malibu with Sean and Madonna at the peak of their paparazzi fame, and writing. You know, I started writing a movie with him. That's why ostensibly I was there. But really, we were just picking up girls. We never got anything done much musically, but I mean, script wise. And, you know, I don't remember exactly. Anyway, yeah. So sorry, it's New York. It's a little noisy.
That's all good.
Yeah. So I ended up doing that. And then I ended up I didn't want to be the guy in the photograph at all. So I found myself working with people who needed lyricists or just kind of general Swiss Army knife type of people like myself, particularly lyricists. And I kind of developed this process of working with singers. It was getting them to write themselves without thought.
Okay,
and then I would say, listen, I'm a really skilled structuralist,
Yeah.
I can take just about anything you say and I can really make it into your thing. So I started this process of like interviewing singers and coming up with material for them based on what you want to know their language, you want to know their interests, you want to know what their vocabulary is, So
it sounds like you're kind of tapping into their soul.
Exactly.
And
right.
then putting it on paper in a way that's eloquent, but yet, I think a lot of times it's canned,
Yeah, exactly.
We're craving to hear each other, to see each other authentically.
Yes.
But to get to that, especially now that I know you were, I didn't know if you were caught up in the Hollywood, whatever you guys call it there. I don't know, but
yeah, no, it's listen, I had a wild ride as far as that went.
Yeah, and so then, I mean,
because Sean Penn and I were so close at the time, and he was like one of the biggest movie stars in the world at the time.
And that's what, for me, I always wonder when you're putting yourself into that external facade and you have millions of people supporting that facade and loving that facade, I think it would be really hard to stay a grounded, but to even really to know who you are at some point. And
I had no idea.
Yeah, and it says like, how far do you go down to actually find the bedrock of who you are? So there's this quote.
Well, I did.
Says it. It's I think everyone should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of, so they can see that's not the answer.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm proof positive of that notion.
But then we get to find out what is our answer, and what have you come to the conclusion of for your life?
Well, listen, I think people go through phases in their lives. And I look at my phase of that entire period of, the people I met, but more particularly I developed a very sort of unique school of lyric writing that I was able to use in a lot of different circumstances, and really what I think in retrospect now, what I think I was doing was learning how to write, learning how to be economical and, elusive and find, the exact right word for the exact right moment. And understand about rhythm.
And I think that's based on all of this experience is rich. You couldn't believe it if you hadn't lived it. But then you've got to be able to put it in a way that doesn't make you like the story. You're now the storyteller. So you have to have like a certain distance above it.
Yeah, it was healthy for me because what I realized, in my period in front of the camera, that left unchecked, I could become a demagogue pretty easily, I could, and I found that happening. I just found myself acting like a big fucking prick all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just didn't like that. So I thought if I could just completely self-abnegate, remove any, and just consider myself a pathway for other people to go through. You know, Sheryl Crow is a classic example of that process, you know, because she had come to us in a real bad situation. She'd made an extremely expensive record with A&M that nobody wanted to put out. So she was $400,000 in debt to A&M at the time. God. And her boyfriend was a keyboard player in the studio band that I was remembering. So I really took, you know, those ideas about how to work with people, and I really applied them to Sheryl, and sometimes in really cruel ways, which I apologize for, Sheryl, if you see this, but you're still horrible. Anyway, so that turned out to be a huge success. But I wasn't entirely happy with it. I didn't feel like I was really engaging the world. And I'd met this guy named Mike Rupert on a Robert Downey Jr. documentary. He made a political documentary. And somehow I found myself in it, and I met this guy, Mike Rupert, and he was kind of a den mother for you know, ex-spies and people like that.
Right.
Whistleblowers. He had this newsletter called From the Wilderness, and he had this kind of community of all these burned out ex-DEA people and people with horrible stories that had been for whatever reason thrown out of the system, and now were left on their own, terrified. And Mike had this kind of newsletter, and he put people together with people, and I said, you know, I'd like to do some of this kind of work, some of this kind of investigative work. Is there anything you can think of that I could do? And he said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact. And he has this ginormous stack of papers. And he says, look through this. And I looked through it, and you know, it's full of autopsy reports and coroner's reports and naval intelligence documents and things like that. And I'm like, you know, what is all this? And he said, well, there's a squad of naval investigative service people who are going around killing people and covering them up as suicides. And we think that it's connected to the CIA's, or not the CIA, but various intelligence military entities were importing cocaine by the literally boatload and plane load into the U.S. This was the early days of of the exposure of what became known as Iran-Contra. In fact, one of the guys was actually the guy that broke that story. This guy, Gary Webb, who actually had a real reporting job. And so it was all connected with all of that. And, you know, that lasted around, I did that for like 6 years off and on. You know, I didn't start out as, you know, I started out kind of getting my feet wet. And then by the end of it, I was flying around. I'd met this guy he's actually now one of my best friends. He's my son's godfather. I probably shouldn't say too much about him, but he'd spent quite a bit of time in Afghanistan, India, Southeast Asia, particularly Burma. And he was a pilot. He had a little plane. He had a little Cessna. So we were flying around all over the place. And I was still working in music. You know, I was doing. I was working with Jewel, this folk singer, as well as Joni Mitchell and I just had found myself in this anyway.
No, I it's just so fascinating how kind of your history, your father's history, grandfather's history, it still kind of keeps interwoven into your, no matter what you decide to do, whether it's, become a musician, a bass player, going to sing, like here comes this other underlaying.
Yes, exactly. I had a unhealthy attraction to it. Later I was diagnosed as I was addicted to fear,
Yes.
Adrenaline rushes and fear. I didn't feel alive unless I was terrified,
Yeah.
Um,
That's your familiar though, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. It's
so formative years, it's becomes your familiar. And then if you don't have it, something seems missing.
Yes, exactly. You don't feel like you're actually there unless you're terrified.
Yeah, yeah.
So that ended very poorly. And anyways,
I can relate to those words.
Yes, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah, that ended poorly.
That ended poorly, as did the Tuesday Music Club. So that began this just cycle of absolute tragedy. One after another, people in one of these two groups were just dying.
Yeah.
Gary. He died actually later, but his death was in the cards for many years. Mike, the guy that got me into it, he shot himself. And then another guy supposedly slit his wrists in a motel in like Arkansas or something like that. But it was physically impossible for him to have done it. It's like, and then the same thing was happening in the Tuesday Music Club. Kevin, the fellow who brought Sheryl into the band, hanged himself accidentally or not. Probably most crushingly was the death of our good friend Bill Bottrell's son, who was 7 years old. His son died very suddenly and horribly. And that, so it was just awash in tragedy. And that was actually, not long after that, it was my son was born. And I was like, oh, I've got to really get my shit together here.
Yeah.
Because, I looked okay, but I was just a freaking basket case. I was, it's a miracle. I either wasn't killed or killed somebody else. It's just a miracle.
Yeah.
Because everybody.
But again, that's not your fault. You go back and you see the writings on the wall. It's a perfect storm.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think that's when you suffer from PTSD and when you're functioning under that familiar of chaos, and then you have a child, and I can relate to that. It's like, oh shit, I got to be a better person. Like,
yes,
like today.
Yeah.
I've got no experience there, but pretty much like there's no going back.
Yeah.
You realize that responsibility. And I think at least with our generation, maybe David, that we have more tools to be better parents, or at least maybe more of a desire than my parents or your parents.
Well, we have the advantage of terrible parenting.
Yes, exactly. I know not what not to do. That's a long list, but then it becomes, well, okay, so like you said, here's what I know what I don't want to do in my career, but that leaves, well, now what is the right approach? And I think for me anyway, that's changed moment to moment. My son's, as I mentioned, was 13. It's like every day is a new day.
Right.
New parenting style. And then I at least want to not impart trauma and chaos.
Well, yeah. It's, it's not, talk about not their fault. It's not their fault. They were born.
Right.
That's this praxis fraught moment in history. So you really need to step up to the plate, you know?
Yes. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. And yeah, so that was actually turned out to be a really good thing for me because well, I needed to change something drastically. So I actually quit everything and I went to music school in Texas. I mean, not music, I went to university. And, figured I'd learn, more about the mechanics of music and orchestration and things like that.
Right.
Conducting. And to just have a nice peaceful time away from all these crazy people that I knew and try to raise this kid and try to figure out, my son's mother and I hardly knew one another.
Yeah.
We literally just met.
Oh, wow.
I was recovering from this savage beating I'd gotten in San Francisco with my writing partner. We were just stomped, and so it had been about a 8 or 10 week physical recovery period that I had to go through, and also there was a lot of psychological ramifications of the beating. So when I recovered, well, I had encountered Sarah, my son's mother, a very good friend of mine. And we, just met and I took this kind of road trip after I was physically healed, not long afterwards. And, when I got back, I found out that she was pregnant. And I was like, wow, this is kind of sudden. But, there's been so much death, right? That having that's something like that. And it turned out to be great. I mean, it was challenging over the years, but, I couldn't have asked for a better result of all of this.
Wait, that's a testament to you. I think that's a testament to your spirit to be able to take everything I've heard just in this last hour would be a challenge for anyone. But then you add in the history and your role models and the trauma and the chaos and that, So that's a testament to you to say, it worked out well. And, it's almost like our generation, we've got to say the buck stops here. The trauma's got to stop here.
Yeah,
I'm not continuing this on anymore. No matter what it takes.
Yeah, we had to break the chain.
Yeah. Which is no easy task.
No, it's almost impossible.
Agree.
Now my mother's a clinical psychologist, or she became one. And I said, it was really hard for me to find it. It had been really hard for me to find a shrink because particularly before the internet was as common as it is now, everything I said sounded so ridiculous.
Right.
that instead of treating my actual problems, people were treating me for things like delusion or,
right.
Just because it just sounded so
impossible,
outrageous. It's like
grandiose.
What?
Yeah,
grandiose, bizarre. What? And so I'd had a really tough time finding a shrink. Finally, my mother found me this woman who was amazing, and she was perfect for me within limits. Because she herself had been trained. She came out of the Israeli military.
Wow. So
she was a Israeli military intelligence colonel prior to taking a practice in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And so she became the perfect shrink for me because suddenly
I was going to say that. You got to have an Israeli ex-military to be able to handle.
Well, I mean, I don't want to make her sound like, she was this wonderful.
No, but
tiny,
you've got to
gentle
have the strength, though. You can't just be the bleeding heart empath of like, let me hear your story. Let me hold. You got to hold space, and that takes a warrior.
Right. And I was a pretty complex.
That's it. Yeah.
I wasn't the easiest interview in the world. But anyway, she had met my mother through courses in clinical hypnosis. And so she started hypnotizing me.
Oh.
And, just kind of walking me through stuff because, as I'm sure you know, what happens with various traumas is, your brain tries to protect the areas that have been traumatized. It kind of seals itself off like a little landmine.
Like white blood cells, a macrophage will
exactly
cover the germ and surround the whole thing like a Pac-Man. But for the emotions, the trauma, we need it out of our body. And it's so hard to even find it.
Her philosophy was not so much that we need to get it out because you can't, but that you have to integrate it into the rest of your system, because the way that she described it to me, and it makes a lot of sense, is that say you have some terrible tragedy when you're 9, say you're gang raped or something horrible.
Right.
So your brain, like you said, seals itself around, but it leaves a little antenna out. And when circumstances feel to you like getting gang raped or attacked or whatever.
Current lockdown.
Well, that part of your brain, which is not matured,
yes,
takes over, says, I'm in charge now. I know just what to do in this situation. And so then before you even know it, you've just left a trail of blood,
Yes.
And
carnage behind you.
Just carnage. Just wrecking.
All somebody did was like maybe touch that little splinter or that antenna. They had no idea. Seems innocuous or innocent enough. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, clean up on aisle 7.
Yeah, exactly. And anyway, in the course of that process, we tripped over some things that my doctor was like, you know what, you have to go somewhere else. And since she gave me this number, she said, I didn't give this to you, she said, basically. So she referred me to this other woman, who is a lifer in trauma. She had actually been in the, I think she was even born in a concentration camp in Germany or Poland. And she was doing really radical work with psychedelic drugs, with DMT.
Yeah.
She would make these teas. Her husband was a chemist. And so we started doing some extremely deep in stuff, using those techniques, which are now becoming much more common, I think.
Well, fortunately, yes, they are. Like psilocybins, MDMA therapy specifically for PTSD, and the vet research is so promising. Like 86% recovered and healed after 2 sessions, and it doesn't come back. No more medication therapy.
Yeah.
But fortunately, hopefully it's becoming more accepted, and plant medicines especially. Like,
I think it could change the world.
I agree 100%. And I've taken up way too much of your time, but to kind of encapsulate at least a little bit of this, I've got to ask, how do you feel now, like, about what's going on in the world? And
it's my worst nightmares. he was always, like for instance, one of the things he said was, don't be an idiot, David. The Third Reich, it didn't end. It moved to Virginia. Like he would say stuff like that.
Right.
I'm just like, hey, yeah. I've been expecting something like this to happen since Reagan. Because I understood that setup. The Reagan Bill Casey setup. I understood the. Jimmy Carter had done something which was right, but it was also really wrong. Namely, the CIA had got completely corrupt and dirty beyond comprehension in the 70s.
But I mean, it seems like to me, everything has gotten corrupt. The medical system has become corrupt. The pharmaceutical industry is corrupt. And it's hard to know exactly where those little tendrils lie. And it just seems to me that our political system has gotten so corrupt. And these two different polarities, they're kind of saying the same thing, but packaged in a different way. And it just seems like now we're fighting against one another. We can't have a debate. We can't have a discussion.
No.
There's no openness to like, here, let me hear your side of the story and let's have a spirited debate. That's gone.
Well, no, because we're dealing with people that have a different knowledge of history.
That's the difference. Or they and they're functioning from a lot of these younger generation, and they're just functioning from what they're reading and scrolling and being programmed from on that TV back there.
Yeah.
So do you see any solutions on an ending note? Do you see any way through this, or do we just have to go through kind of that?
Yeah, I think the only way through it is to really go through it. We punted with Watergate and we let people skate.
Yes.
And we punted with Iran Contra, let people skate. They came back. Yeah. We punted on the fake invasion, the falsified reason to invade Iraq after 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And what, we can't do that anymore. We have to actually take stock. And 73 million Americans are going to scream their heads off. And, they're tearing the country apart because we can't have, it's like if you have a household and daddy thinks the world is flat and the aliens are giving him instructions and, and black people are the devil's spawn or God knows what,
Right.
You can't meet that halfway. You can say, well, you need treatment is what you need.
Right.
No, but of course the hardest thing to convince somebody is that they need treatment.
Yeah. We need to, there's certain times that there's no point in having any kind of discussion if that's, I mean, I worked in locked psychiatric hospitals, and you don't argue with someone's fixed delusion.
No.
That's their world, right?
Yeah. What good did it tell us? No, you in fact are not. But
right. And the ones that are grounded that, might just need a little more information to understand. That's who I think we need to have these discussions with. And that's at least my solution to all of this is to come together and be united in whatever way we can to get rid of the corruption. The corruption is now coming to light. I think we're all seeing it for a deeper level of what it is. At least I hope so.
I think, yeah. I mean, I think if there are two benefits to this debacle, that would be one of them.
Yeah.
It's just impossible to ignore now. And the other is, well, on a more sinister level, as a friend of mine put it, well, these idiots have spent the last 4 years showing us where their arms depots are.
Oh, great.
So we can, this would provide a wonderful opportunity to just kind of roll up some of these people and put them in jail. Because, these are dangerous people. And, a lot of them, a lot of them are in the drug and gun business,
Right.
There's a lot of these guys, a lot of these sort of so-called patriot groups are actually, crystal meth and opioid.
And speaking of that, like all the CEOs and CFOs of these pharmaceutical companies are convicted felons.
Yeah.
They've never done jail time, but that's what I mean. It's like once you start going down these, little threads of seeing where the corruption lies, it's everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, the danger is there was a guy named Chalmers Johnson. Does that name ring a bell to you?
No.
Well, he wrote several books. He was a really good friend of the family. And yeah, Chalmers Johnson. I mean, if you read he wrote this America trilogy. He was similar to my dad in a way. He'd started out with intelligence. He'd spent a lot of time in Asia. And he was actually operational, but he was also in that kind of Daniel Ellsberg mindset. And I think he did help Ellsberg get the Pentagon Papers out. But he definitely switched sides. He was like, okay, we can't do this.
Right.
And one of his, he was a real historian, and he kind of looked at all the various attempts at democracies that had been attempted over the years, and he found that, at the best of times, they tend to last around 240 or 250 years. And of course, that's about where we are now.
Yeah.
That was how long Roman democracy lasted. And there's this tremendous tension in a society, particularly one like ours, which really prides itself on equality and justice and things like that, which we've never really proffered out.
Right.
We've never lived up to these promises.
Yeah.
But the schism develops between empire and democracy.
Mm-hmm.
The things that empires need to do are impossible to achieve in a real democracy, because we would never sign off on it. We would never sign off on basically U.S. foreign policy from 1948 to the present.
Right.
We have spared no effort in allying ourselves with fascists of every description. There is a wide, deep, and extremely well-funded river of fascism running through, running through our veins, running through the veins of our establishment structures. Everything from the military to banking to
everything.
God, everything. The American Medical Association. It's just like everything is kind of corrupted by this internal. What is it? Dissonance. The
cognitive dissonance.
The cognitive dissonance between what we're actually doing and who we claim to be.
Well, and that I think it's the collapse of a paradigm or a zeitgeist, and it's so hard, it's so difficult to see, or to be one of the few that see beyond it, or in the midst of it collapsing. It's very uncomfortable, and it brings up, I think, whatever demons that you were trying to live above or facing or haven't faced, those are all coming up too with all of this. So it's going to trigger you. It's going to trigger those parts of yourself that don't like to be told what to do, or loss of freedoms, or whatever else is going on.
Yeah.
That's coming. You're adding to the collective.
Yes, we all are. I mean, that's the thing. One of the there were two things that happened, I think, to us as people in relative recent history. One was at some point we stopped being citizens and we became consumers, which is a substantial difference.
And I mean, we had advertising, and we had the ability to control the youth through this advertising, which has gone haywire. You know, when you and I were kids, it was like commercial here or there on Saturday morning cartoons, and you'd ask your mom to buy it and she'd say no.
Right.
But this is like, it's in their TikTok and their Insta feeds and their friends. It's like, I don't have any hope with just saying no. It's like, it's no to this. No. Right. It's like, you got to turn this off. And I think we all, what all of this boils down to for me is going within and trusting my intuition, my wisdom, while being informed, not inundated with what's going on. And to think for myself, so that I'm not, so when I'm in fear, my prefrontal cortex shuts off.
Yes, exactly.
So then I get to look to, hey, you tell me what to do, because I don't know, I'm scared.
Right.
And that's where
I'll put a Trump flag on my truck and go roaring around and insulting people.
Because he said he's going to save me, or I
mean, well, you know, it's funny, you know, it's funny, not necessarily funny, but you know, religion, you know, when Constantine said, when the Roman Emperor Constantine said, you know what, Christianity is the Roman official religion. It wasn't because he'd had any kind of revelation. It was that he recognized that a monotheistic religion is a great partner to a totalitarian government. You know, they hit the same.
It's very similar. It's a very similar approach. You know, you give people a problem, you create a fear, and then you tell them that they are the solution to the problem.
Right, exactly. You're going to go to hell if you don't listen to me. And you know, so you know, the mechanics of it, of the Council of Nicaea or whatever, aren't all that important. But so what you have is, you have a huge selection of people who are not only laboring under the weight of an entirely false history, laboring under a hatred of science.
Yes.
But they've also been primed for totalitarianism by this particular religious thing, which is what it was designed to do. I mean, that's why the Romans chose it. It wasn't because they liked it.
100%. And if you're in fear, I'm not going to think for myself. So it's as good as anything else I've got. I'm going to go with it.
Exactly.
You know, and again, you're right. This hasn't been happening for the last 4 years, 10 years. It's like last 200 years at least. This has been
I would say
step up.
Yeah, I would say thousands. You know, I mean, the political requirements of, well, you know, let's go back to our little big family. You know, so Daddy believes in flat Earth, and the kid, and he spends all of the family money on guns and is always threatening his neighbors.
Right.
Or actually, no. Marcus Welby is your dad, you know, the perfect, gray-templed, wise, paternal family doctor guy. Yeah. And he's just the greatest. And he tells you the stories you want to hear, and he's comforting. But, you know, every day he goes out and he shoots people and he tortures them. And then he comes home and you're like, oh, hi, Daddy.
Yeah.
The tension and the dissonance that's created in that household will tear it apart. It will tear it apart.
Yeah. And it will tear yourself apart. It's like, how can I love somebody that is completely in opposition of everything I value and everything I believe in?
Yes, exactly. I mean, something like that.
I love him, but that's your heart. So it's like, here's my heart loving this person who is my father, who's a kind, loving person to me. Yeah. And an absolute monster on the outside.
Exactly right. He goes off.
So now we've got like that chasm of chaos comes back in, and the dissonance, and probably a little bit of loss of identity.
Yeah, a few nights ago, I watched a movie which I had seen as a young man, but never quite appreciated. It's a French film called State of Siege.
Mm.
And it's kind of about that. It's about this guy. It's a true story. I think he had 7 or 9 children. He was this upstanding member of the community. He was but really his job was to train Latin American dictators in torture. He was a torture trainer. And this I think Ecuador, rebel group called the Tupamaros were extremely sophisticated, and they kidnapped him, and they were able to interrogate him and uncover quite a bit of stuff about what we were doing in Latin America. And it's basically that. It's this guy. He's a totally respectable looking guy. He's got this nice family with these nice kids, and he's a good daddy, and he teaches his kid to ride a tricycle. And then he goes off and he instructs a bunch of, hand-picked sadists from some Latin American police department. He's got a guy naked on stage, and they're sticking, he's saying, well, if you apply, 140 watts in the intranasal cavity, bolt or whatever, so, it's, and in a sense, this is the challenge that has faced us, is that, and for the most unfortunate among us, they want a simple answer to it all. And the simple answer is that anybody that tells them the truth is evil. It's like a drug addict. If you try to get in between a drug addict and his drug, that guy's going to try to kill you, Yeah. And that's kind of what we're facing. They've been indoctrinated in this entirely false history. Things that just did not happen. As to a large extent, we all are.
Well, that's another big part of the problem, is that indoctrination. The sky is blue, and all of this is facts, and I will fight to prove those facts to my death, because that's my paradigm. That's who I am. Don't disrupt my whole world. It's like if my world is flat, let's keep it there.
Exactly right.
Everything else is an absolute threat.
Yes, that's a challenge.
That's the challenge, and I do have to wrap it up, but I want to, from my heart, thank you for sharing this time with me.
It's an interesting topic.
I got to wrap my head around all of this. That is you, that encompasses you, and what I love to do, David, is like speak from the heart and hear you speak your story. And it is so fascinating to me, the way we bump up into each other's universes, and I get to see kind of how you see the world. And it is incredible the way we still, almost like the stars that make up you, are still realigning with all of that ancestral history and the magnitude of your life. You are meant for greatness, and you're definitely stepping into that. But I see it.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I appreciate that very much, and I admire what you're doing, and I'm glad to have been able to help out.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate you. And from my heart to yours, thank you.
Well, thank you too, and likewise.